in our session looking at sport in the communities post-COVID-19. Our second panel consists of Nicola Walker, the CEO at Sported, and Mark Lawrie, CEO at StreetGames. Nicola and Mark, thank you very much for joining us today.
My pleasure.
Thank you very much for the invitation.
Thank you. I've got a very simple question for you to kick off to both of you. We saw that activity levels fell 6% during the first lockdown nearly a year ago, and they didn't recover in the period prior to the second lockdown. How do you think it is that we should be, what do you think we ought to do in order to correct that, to bring activity levels back up to where they were prior to the pandemic? Who wants to go with that, Mark or Nicola?
Okay, I'll go first.
Yeah.
Thank you, Chair. I think one of the big challenge is of getting participation up again, particularly with children and young people, is access to the right places to go and play and the right groups. And even between the two lockdowns, as you mentioned, during the summer, a lot of the groups that we work with that provide those participation opportunities for children and young people were very, very nervous about the things they had to meet in terms of COVID security, and were concerned about the group sizes of children and young people that they could get together from a legal perspective and from a health and safety perspective. So from my point of view, the most crucial thing in terms of getting those groups that we're concerned about back active again is about opening up the access fully to those groups and organisations in a safe way that they connect with locally.
Nicola?
Yeah, and from the Sported network, around a third of our members didn't reopen between lockdown 1 and lockdown 2, even in areas where they were allowed to. That came down to a number of areas. Some of it was cost. They were short on funds. They had to hire facilities. They needed to buy PPE. They needed to ensure social distancing. And a lot of it was to do with nervousness, I think, both amongst the volunteers, whether or not they felt safe to be delivering sport, and the habits of the young children and getting the young children back into their activities. So I think there wasn't quite enough time in that middle period to really get the sector back up and running. I think what I'm nervous about now is that as we look to open these groups again towards the end of March, I think we'll face very similar issues, which is how these groups actually do get to a position where they can afford to open, where they have facilities where they can operate, and where young children and volunteers feel comfortable to go.
Yeah, Nicola, just on that point, are you confident that it will be different this time around?
No, I think if anything, it's going to be more difficult actually, because groups have now had a very long sustained period of time without operating, without income. Children, I think, as both Nihal and Louise mentioned, have got out of the habit of playing in their sports. And so, yes, there's a great deal of nervousness for the group operators and the group organisers that the young people will return. And the facilities point, I don't think can be underestimated. 85% of the grassroots sports that we support don't have their own facilities. And that was certainly true of the netball and football examples that we've just seen. And actually the operators of those facilities themselves are going to have to create social distance, have potentially less groups and customers coming through. And the nervousness is that community sports are disadvantaged in that respect, in that they don't necessarily pay the same rates that others might do.
Okay, thank you. Damien Hines?
Thank you, Julian. And Mark and Nicola, good morning. Just to set the scene, can you just say a bit about the types of clubs that you work with and the variety in them and their importance to community sport and activity, maybe starting with Nicola?
Yeah, so Sported is the UK's largest network of grassroots community clubs. We have 2,600 groups, a third of which are in very deprived areas across the UK. We are sport agnostic. There's about 96 different sports that our groups employ, and many of our groups are multi-sport groups. So for them, and the reason that we support them, is that the sport is the means to the end, in that they're there for some kind of social outcome, generally to do with the health of their communities, the health of their young people, education, employability, prospects. So Whereas in previous conversations, we talked about NGBs and the support that NGBs can give. Actually, if you're a youth group that uses sport to engage young people, you may not only deliver just one sport, you deliver a number of sports. Our groups are very heavily led by volunteers. Over half of them have no paid member of staff. So it's entirely volunteer led, and they generally operate on less than £10,000 a year.
So just, Mark, sorry, just before I come to you, just pick up that point, Nicola, about the multi-sports clubs. Is that a trend? Are you seeing a growth in those multi-sports clubs, or has it always been those kind of proportions?
I think it's always been there, actually. Yeah. I think that we tend to focus on those sports that either have heavy spectator aspects to them, or that we play at school. But actually, I think where groups are being clever, and we talked before about inclusion, particularly of girls, is to introduce activities which aren't those traditional team sports that you have to be good at school in order to participate, whether that's yoga or frisbee or dance. I think groups are tending to use activities that they think will best engage the young people who are currently inactive.
Yeah, thank you. And Mark.
Thank you. So StreetGames works solely in the most disadvantaged areas of the country. So we have our roots in community regeneration. We started as a very small charity in neighbourhood renewal areas about 15 years ago. So the kinds of organisations that we support are locally trusted, heavily embedded in their communities, often running out of community centres or even just using a local games area. And similar to what Nicola was saying, they're very much about improving the quality of life in their neighbourhood. So sport and physical activity is part of what they do. They want their communities to be healthier, safer, more successful. We support a network across the UK, which is smaller than Nicola's, about 1,400, but less than 15% of those are affiliated to NGBs. They tend to be charities, community interest companies. We also work with larger bodies like housing associations and local authorities, because what we know is as long as those organisations take a community-focused approach, an asset-based approach, even larger organisations can still engage the young people that we're concerned about in those neighbourhoods. I think the thing that is, again, slightly different to our work from Sported is that a lot of our groups have at least one paid member of staff. And the reason for that is that the levels of volunteering in the most deprived areas are still stubbornly low. So trying to get the human capital, the social capital to get volunteers to run activity is actually extremely hard.
Thank you. And Nicola, so you wanted to come back? Yeah,
I wouldn't mind commenting on that, because you asked the question before about how to get more volunteers into sport, and actually I think the key response is to ask slightly less of them. The sorts of hours that Louise and Nihal were putting in were just enormous, and across our organisations of our 2,600, there are 500,000 hours a week of volunteering being given. And I think that's off-putting for many people who would like to get engaged, but actually get behind a structure where their help is supporting rather than running. The paid staff makes a massive difference to an organisation's sustainability.
So let me ask then the same question I asked at the end with the previous two witnesses. I mean, do you have in mind one or two sort of practical things that could start to make a dent in the total amount of admin time asked of volunteers? I'll ask you both, but starting with Nicola.
So the two main areas for me, I think, are around facilities and funding. Facilities, I think, are a constant challenge for groups in terms of trying to get access to affordable facilities that they can use at a time that meet their young participants. And that is a challenge that I think takes quite a lot of organising and quite a lot of time. Funding is difficult because every funding application is slightly different. Funding application needs a different set of criteria around your governance, around your measurement and impact. It has to be written in a certain style. And of course, the success rates aren't huge. And where you're using volunteers to constantly look for funds to support the group, then that's very time consuming. So having some kind of a centralized approach to funding, not the funds themselves, but just the methodology. And for those funders to be prepared to support core activity as opposed to sort of shiny new projects which funders can often like. And then, sorry, the last thing I think was actually the efficiencies of volunteering that we talked about before, which was creating more centralised resources which can be used by volunteers, particularly during COVID. You imagine that you run a multi-sports operation in an area, you're having to deal with local rules around COVID and safety, you're having to deal with each of the individual rules of the different sports. You know, it becomes incredibly difficult to try and collate all of that information coming at you. And so I think there is an element with which we can help volunteers by translating the information that they need to run their clubs effectively.
So on that point you made about, I mean, effectively a sort of funding clearinghouse with standard processes and standardised reporting. I mean, I guess there's nothing that would have stopped that happening already. I mean, it's presumably within the gift of the big governing bodies to get together to do something, maybe prodded by government. I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on why it hasn't happened?
I think reporting is difficult in that each group is funding a slightly different project with a slightly different outcome. And I think that's a challenge for the entire sector, actually, which is a lot of the evidence base of the sport for development sector is qualitative. It is outcomes based. It's often difficult to quantify that. But I think that the sector has failed to really come up with a set of metrics that we're happy to be judged by, and then to sell that into funders is something that is being worked on but hasn't ever quite been resolved. No. I think in terms of creating one centralised pot, that would never be feasible. But I do think for funders to understand that asking similar questions, having application forms in similar ways would save huge amounts of time for volunteers. Everything to meet a specific funder's needs.
But you do have things like community foundations, which they're not like a single pot, but they're a way of funneling, different groups who are funding something and different groups who are after something, and just sort of streamlining the whole process. Because when you've got thousands of buyers and thousands of sellers, you need a marketplace, you need a shop to bring them together. I just wonder if there's anything else that would stop that happening, any impediments.
Well, one thing is access, actually, is just knowing where these groups are. I think that's been one of the biggest challenges for some of the larger groups. So having moved away from that local authority position that was discussed earlier, it's difficult for those large organisations to know where all these very small groups are in really quite deprived areas. And one of the wonderful things that I think has happened during COVID is that the sports councils, both Sport England and Sport Wales, have used national partners like Sported and StreetGames to distribute grants through down to organisations where we do have access, where they wouldn't necessarily ordinarily see themselves as a customer of a sports body. And the other thing that those grants have both done is become very liberal in terms of the sorts of information that you need to provide during COVID in order to get grants. So things that have been new to our sector, like video applications, for example, have been really welcomed by groups who struggle. Maybe English isn't their first language, and they struggle with a formalised application form.
Thank you. And Mark, your practical proposals for reducing the admin burden.
I think, to build on what Nicola was saying, we did a piece of work with the University of Bedford a few years ago where we looked at the small grants forms of all the lottery distributors and how actually got some of their undergraduate students to try and complete them. And what we found is that you had to be operating at A-level standard or above to actually answer the questions that were being asked. And for that reason, a large part of our network, certainly over the last 10 years, when you look back, less than 10% of small grants from the lottery distributors have gone to groups like the ones we support in the most deprived areas. And a large part of that is the process. And I'd agree with Nicola, I'd give a lot of credit to Sport England for the way that they've developed the Tackling Inequalities Fund in a way that allows groups to show video, to reduce the amount of information they give for funding. I think on the impact point, we've been involved in a piece of work with the Sport for Development Coalition around creating a very simple to use impact portal that local groups can use, and they can measure themselves against the Office for National Statistics marker questions around mental well-being and physical well-being, so that there is a route to make this easier for local organisations and to help volunteers. And if I may, the final point I would make, Nicola's point about guidance for volunteers, I think Sport England, with their return to play guidance on their website, it's so clear and so logical in terms of helping volunteers to try and understand what they can and can't do in different situations. So I think maintaining that level of simplicity as we go forward will really help volunteers.
Thank you, Mark. That's all from me, Chairman. Back to you.
Thank you. Charles Watling.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. And first of all, I'd like to say thank you both for coming and thank you for the great work you're doing out there in the community. Really appreciated by so many people. I'm going to be mercifully brief because a lot of the points I wanted to cover have indeed been covered. But it's all very well to talk about finances. We know that they're vital in an academic way. But sported leaders have said that the biggest concern is the well-being of the participants. Now, I think this is for you, Nicola, really. How are the groups you support handling the pandemic and what sort of feedback have you had?
Thank you, Giles. That's a brilliant question, and actually is about the one area that I thought hadn't been covered yet. We've been running some surveys throughout COVID, so from March right through to this month, where we've asked community groups what their biggest concern is. And whilst those have slightly changed over the months as financial concerns and then relief funds coming through, and now issues around return to play have come to fore, the most consistent concern for our leaders throughout the entire pandemic has been the mental health of their young participants, many of whom they haven't been able to contact because they didn't have in place the digital technology. But certainly 60% of them say that their primary concern is the well-being of their young people.
Mark, have you got anything to add to that?
Yes, I'd echo the comment about mental well-being. I mean, part of what I think COVID has done nationally is shone a light on some of the issues in some of the areas that ourselves and Sported both focus in. And actually the incidence of poor mental health among children in deprived areas was already 3 times higher before the pandemic started. And the numbers have just gone up and up and up. And so a lot of the work that we've done through our training academy, and Narmal mentioned the activator workshops in the last session, has been about supporting coaches and leaders to have mental health conversations with young people. So actually helping them with the mentoring skills to talk on the phone to young people if they can't access digital, to guide and support them as much as they can without being face to face. And we've had a huge demand as well for our mental health first aid courses that we run, which aren't a panacea, they're not the answer to everything, but they do give coaches, leaders and project workers that starting point for understanding the basics of mental health, and then being able to refer young people on if they can tell that the problem is really acute, referring them on to other services, child and adolescent mental health services, local voluntary sector charities that support children's mental health. So it is a huge issue. It's only going to get bigger, I suspect, as children come back to school. And so the role that the organisations that we work with play is just so fundamental, because the young people trust their coaches and leaders to help them.
Right, so we're starting sort of on the back foot, and it's getting worse as we go on. So there's going to be a lot of catch up to do, I take from your answers there. So, okay, that's talking about the actual participants. Now, who helps the helpers? As we've heard a lot here, volunteers are such a major part of all that you do. And it's been reported that many of the volunteers are physically and mentally exhausted. So what can we do to reach out to them? What can we do? Nicola.
Well, I think that emotional burden has been huge, actually. And again, the surveys that we've done have shown that the levels of anxiety of the leaders is much higher than the national population. So it is a concern. Clearly, they've been worried for their young people. They've been worried for the sustainability of their groups. Actually, in the first lockdown, Sported called and just gave moral support for many of these groups who didn't feel they were having that. That was some element of help, which is just being able to talk through and being able to understand that other people were also suffering in the same way. I do think that some of the work that Mark's doing at StreetGames around supporting the leaders to help their young people is absolutely critical, but also that sort of oxygen mask on first piece, which is how do we also give the mental health support to the leaders themselves? It isn't an easy answer to give, actually, because there is this huge pent-up demand. I think the Centre for Mental Health have said there's something like 1.5 million children who now have mental health issues, and that has dramatically increased during COVID. So there is this slight tsunami, I think, that leaders are aware of. So looking after their health is going to be key.
I would imagine, if I may, Nicola and Mark, that there's a big sort of roll up the sleeves and let's get on with it, because people must be realising the monumental task ahead of them. And as we saw the NHS step up to the plate in so many ways over the pandemic directly, I should imagine there's that sort of sentiment, if you like, going through the volunteers. Is that so?
Yes, I would definitely have said so, and I do think as well that the volunteers, as much as they are struggling, I completely agree, are very willing to accept support. So we've always run network meetings for the LTOs we work with, where they can come together and talk and share. One of the benefits in some ways of being locked down in a pandemic is that we can have volunteers from Cornwall to Newcastle talking to each other, supporting each other in the way that we're talking now. So actually there have been some real positives in the way that volunteers and project leaders have supported each other. I do think our experience from last summer, though, when some were delivering, is that there's a real challenge around passing young people on for support to core services. So with the thresholds for things like safeguarding and mental health within public sector services so high, projects can often be trying to get young people the support they need, but if they don't meet a threshold because they're not considered to be struggling enough almost, they end up going home on a Friday. And I had several examples of this. I spoke to a coach in Derby on a Friday night who was saying they'd been running their holiday activities all week and they were really worried about that child going home, but they didn't meet the statutory threshold to be taken into care or to be supported. So I think there's a real additional layer of pressure there on volunteers, and we need to make as many connections around them and for them to help support them in that situation with the young people.
One of the silver linings to this extremely dark cloud that we're under is we've improved communications. I take that from what you've just been saying, and we don't want to throw that away when we get back to something like normal. I'm going to leave it there because most of it's been covered, but thank you so much for all you do. Thank you. Back to you, Chair.
Thank you, Giles. Clive Efford. You muted yourself, Clive.
Sorry, I thought I was unmuted. Sorry, welcome, Mark and Nicola. Can I say just how bad is the crisis that we're facing for grassroots sport? Which one of you would like to take that on?
I think it's really nuanced, actually. I thought originally when we did our initial surveys with organisations, there was a genuine sense of panic and a real concern about funding. And actually, because Sport England stepped up, Sport Wales stepped up, government stepped up with emergency funding, quite a lot of the organisations that were initially vulnerable in the pandemic managed to get through the summer into the autumn in reasonable shape. We had around, when we did our survey, we had around 4% of organisations that said they were in critical trouble, and we were then able to go and give them support to access funding. I think what's more of a concern looking forwards is that obviously a lot of funders have put an awful lot into pandemic relief in the last 11, 12 months, and the forward-looking funding landscape for local community organisations could be an awful lot tougher. So actually what we're finding now is that the confidence of those organisations about their financial sustainability has dropped from about 60% to about 20% in the last 6 months, which is a significant concern for us. And for a lot of them, the things that they do, the Robin Hood things that they do to generate income, like going into schools and running paid for after school sessions to subsidise their free community sessions, they just haven't been able to do. And it's not entirely clear at this stage when schools will feel confident to be able to let them do so. So there's an awful lot of factors at play for these local organisations, but the forward outlook, whereas before they've historically always been really agile, able to bring in funding from lots of different sources, they feel a lot more fragile. They've used a huge amount of energy during the pandemic supporting their communities. They've spent their reserves, a lot of them, to give the additional support outside of sport and physical activity, supporting with the wider needs of families and children and young people. So we have real concerns about how we support their sustainability going forwards.
Nicola.
Yeah, and I wholeheartedly agree with Mark again. Certainly before COVID even hit, around a quarter of our groups weren't sure that they would be in existence in 6 months' time. So this was already a very fragile environment for these very small groups. Interestingly, now that number is lower, so only 1 in 10 actually think that they won't survive. Partly, I think, because of the funds that have been available, which have been swiftly delivered, certainly in some of the nations. And secondly, actually, the smaller the group, the less their outgoings were. So one of the advantages of not having paid staff, of not having facilities, is that they could mothball for a while and then hopefully, start to reopen when they could. So what's really replaced that now is the challenge, which is how will they restart? How do they get that initial seed capital to get back up and running? How do they get their young people back? And we think about a quarter of groups may not restart, that the sheer effort of getting back up and getting everything sorted out again may be too much for them. So I think a real focus on returning to play, which again, many of the sports councils are already looking at. And then the last point for me, I think, is around the inequalities of sport provision, which again, as we all recognise, were huge, be that through gender, ethnicity, disability before COVID hit. And those inequalities have got even worse. And certainly if you look at something like disability sport, for example, much more nervous about reopening because of some of the implications of so doing.
And the way we fund sport, we quite often pour money in at the top at the national governing body level and expect it to reach, grassroots community level. Is that a proper way to go about funding sport, do you think? Or should we be funding the grassroots more in a direct way?
I think, sorry, do you want to go, Mark?
No, go on, Nicola, after you.
I think there already has been some change, actually. I think a lot of the sports bodies are already using organisations like Sported and StreetGames to distribute down to community sports, recognising that they don't necessarily fit within the structure of the national governing bodies. And certainly we've just done some research in terms of whether our groups are associated with national governing bodies and how they use those governing bodies. And it's been interesting. We have a slightly higher percentage of groups that are with governing bodies, about 2/3. They tend to use their governing bodies for the sport aspects of what they do. So coaching development, sport insurance, etc. Not necessarily the resilience and sustainability of the group. So I think as the shift has made towards organisational strength rather than sporting strength, then so there is a need for a different type of organisation to help grassroots with those.
Mark, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think actually what we need is a mixed model, because actually NGBs are not a homogenous group. So when you look at organisations like boxing and basketball and rugby league, who are sports that we work with, and tennis, they actually have really committed over the last few years to taking the funding that they get from Sport England and others and ensuring that it does get down into grassroots organisations. Others maybe not so much, but our finding as well is that to get funding right into place so that local groups can access it, you need to actually support them to look broader than sports money. So we have a number of what we call sustainability leads that support local organisations. And during the period between April and December last year, they put £4 million into the hands of local groups, of which only 15% came from sport. The other 85% came from other funders who were interested in what sport could do to deliver their outcomes. So that catalyst of us having some resource from Sport England and Sport Wales to set that up allowed us to attract a great deal more funding into those groups who really need it on the ground.
You were talking earlier on about the problems for small organisations to bid for funds. Do you think that that local authorities miss a trick here? If they were to provide, I don't know, a small team of officers, maybe even a couple, to assist with those small groups making those bids, in terms of inward investment into sport and probably facilities and other things, wouldn't they have a much bigger bang for their bucks if they were to invest in that way? Should local authorities be doing more of that?
I don't know whether, I mean, it would be an ideal scenario if local authorities could, but actually I think there's a number of organisations in the sports world that can do it. So active partnerships are in a good position to be able to help local organisations with funding applications. Ourselves and Sported, we work with our members to support them to make funding applications. We've actually just been piloting a programme where we're not writing bids for local organisations, but we're helping them take a step-by-step approach so that we actually build their ability to do it over time. So I think local authorities could definitely have a role. You could have a support unit that would help with that, but you've also then got some of the residue of the CBSs, obviously, in local areas. They have a role in supporting funding, and even the community foundations, who I think were mentioned earlier, a lot of them have now got to a position where they're helping organisations to look at how they bid. So,
and do you think that people have the knowledge at the grassroots level? I mean, people. See, sometimes, you know, as MPs, you have people come to you and say, look, you know, there's got the kids in my local community. I want to do something for them. And there's a lot of enthusiasm and goodwill there, but of course there's not the capacity to set up a governing body and you know, fill in memberships and articles of association and get to a point where you can bid for money. How do you grasp that sort of goodwill at grassroots level and not lose it in the bureaucracy and the minefield of trying to get some support from governing body or Sport England or whoever?
I think what you need to do really in that scenario, what we've done in the past, is connect them into a body that can carry the governance weight for them. So actually, I mentioned housing associations earlier, where you've got, I can think of an example in Brighton where on an estate up there, they've now got a triathlon club. Now, the people involved, as you say, Clive, they didn't want to set up the governance structure and all the rest of it, but they were picked up by Bolton at Home, the local housing association, and they helped that group of residents to gain the funding to deliver the triathlon club, which was a bit unlikely in that particular area, but that's what they decided they wanted to do. So I think there are structures that people who are really keen can be plugged into at a local level. And those that do want to constitute themselves, I think organisations like ourselves, Sported, Active Partnerships and others have got tools, templates, things that can speed that process up for them.
And again, a question to either of you. Is there anything that you would change about how Sport England and NGBs deliver resources and support to community level?
Well, I think the whole conversation really has been about how we access those deprived community groups who wouldn't necessarily have seen themselves as the correct audience for a large sporting body in any of the regions in the UK. Actually, the Uniting the Movement strategy that Sport England have just released, we feel is excellent in that it really does focus on tackling inequalities and reaching those that haven't previously been reached. I think the challenge is creating some structure around those groups. There is no one set of figures as to even how many groups there are out there. We did some calculations that there were probably 58,000 community groups who were working on a sport for development purpose, and we have 2,500 of those. So a lot of these groups are still not benefiting from support from any of these environments. So I think one of the first things is actually being able to quantify and identify and reach groups in order to be able to make sure that funds and resources, etc., are made available to them.
I mean, you say that you think that Sport England's strategy is excellent, but is it really going to cut through? Because, I mean, one of the criticisms of Sport England over a very long period of time now is that they've been very good at capturing the low-hanging fruit, but they've not really cut through in terms of dealing with inequalities and social exclusion. so they haven't got to those harder to reach sections of the community. I mean, do you think that's a fair criticism, and you think that that's going to change?
I think it's a fair criticism they would accept as well. I think they absolutely appreciate that there have been demographics which have been more difficult to engage in sport. I think there is a recognition across most deliverables that local people delivering local activities who really know their community and their young people is the solution. The question is how to support that infrastructure to make sure that there aren't barriers for those people to participate.
And so can you give an example of where they've actually done that? Is there any positive examples of where an NGB or Sport England have supported community groups and at the real grassroots level?
Yeah, I think both. Sorry, do you want to come up?
Yeah, I mean, I think the best example is probably the local delivery pilots that Sport England have been running for the last 4 years, because they've been very much looking at the needs almost at a neighbourhood level in some cases, and trying to make sure that funding gets right into the hands of local groups. I was talking to the person who is involved in the one in Wigan, and they've been doing things like giving groups £50 just to put a basketball hoop up on the outside of their building so that the kids can play basketball. Now that's not a huge funding decision, but actually that's the kind of thing that can make an enormous difference in a local community to children just being that bit more active. So I don't think we're anywhere near a long way through the journey. I mean, these inequalities, I've been in the industry 20 odd years, and we've been talking about these kinds of inequalities all that time. And it's about the whole of the sector wanting to really tackle it. I think Sport England's intent in uniting the movement around proportionate universalism, so actually putting the money in the areas where it's most needed and towards the groups where it's most needed, if that's followed through, I think that will make a huge difference. The other thing is that there are some really good governing bodies. We do a lot of work with governing bodies both in England and Wales. The LTA with us last summer during the pandemic, we gave out 5,000 sets of rackets and balls to children living in the most deprived areas of England and Wales. The Welsh Rugby Union gave out 100 plus rugby balls to 100 families. Badminton got involved in giving out kit, and all of these things, even though they're just maybe small things to start with, it's about intent, and it's about a shift of purpose away from just purely governing the competitive aspects of traditional sport towards actually playing their part in tackling inequalities.
Okay, do you have anything to add, Nicola?
I think that the Tackling Inequalities Fund has actually made many groups who wouldn't ordinarily have benefited from Sport England funding realise that they are the sorts of organisations that can benefit now. So I think the support that they've received during COVID will actually have changed their perception of their sports bodies across all 4 of the nations.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Clive. To both of you, the government's just announced that it wants once more to wade into the cesspit that is FIFA in order to try and host the 2030 World Cup. Does the government's focus on elite sport and, for example, Olympic medals, does that frustrate you when you see kids up and down the country being inactive, when you see obesity levels as they are, and when you see sports clubs closing? What are your thoughts on that?
Shall I go first, Nicola?
The hospital pass, Mark.
The hospital pass. I'll catch it and then pass it across to Nicola. I have to say that as StreetGames, we have used the power of major events since we were formed to drive participation in local communities. So if you look at London 2012, we did a huge amount of work in terms of bringing the magic of the games into local communities and getting things like pop-up bags for Olympic sports so that children and young people could watch what was happening on the television and then could enact it in their park or their back garden. We did the same around 2014 in the Commonwealth Games in Glasgow. We've done the same around the Rugby World Cup when it was here in 2015. So to half answer your question, I suspect, Chair, I do think that elite sport can have a really positive impact on grassroots sport in communities, but we're already talking to Birmingham 2022 about how are the 65,000 children on free school meals in Birmingham going to feel connected to that games that's going to be taking place right in the middle of their city, in some cases in Perry Bar, where the athletic stadium is, right in the middle of some of the most deprived areas of the city as well. So I think there is definitely an argument for using major events to impact on participation in our most disadvantaged areas.
Nicola.
Yeah, and sport in itself actually is a legacy of the 2012 Olympics. So certainly big events do generate long-term support, and for the Euros and the Commonwealth Games, etc. There are big legacy projects underway to make sure that young people also benefit. I think a separate point that I would make is almost that they're like two different sectors, two completely different industries, and there aren't sufficient employability pathways that move you through from community sport to elite sport. Certainly we did a report recently on racism in community sport. And one of the frustrations was actually that lack of pathways through from individuals who volunteer, who find employability in grassroots sports. And there's almost no route from which they can take the experience gained there and take that through to elite organisations.
Is £250,000 per medal worth it, Nicola? What could you do with £250,000?
Well, £250,000 clearly would help an enormous amount of young people at a community level.
But is it worth it?
It's so difficult to make a comparison between the two. As I say, it's almost like two different sectors, in that with that £250,000, one assumes will come media rights and employability and legacy, etc. There are other benefits associated with it. But certainly I think sport does suffer from extreme wealth at one end, very overt, media-centric wealth. And then on the other hand, the deprivation that many of the community groups face, where they're struggling to get the subs in and to spend a few £1,000s a year that they do operating their groups. So I think it's probably a perception issue, actually, rather than an economic issue.
Okay, yeah, but obviously, there's £2.5 million already of seed funding effectively been announced to scope out, for example, the 2030 World Cup bid. And knowing the way government works, there's obviously going to be quite a bit of time, ministerial time and official time now taken up with organising ourselves in order to inevitably go over to FIFA with our begging bowl and no doubt probably be humiliated. I'm just wondering whether or not you think that is actually a good use of departmental time, and whether or not you think that it would be a better use of that time in order to focus on our kids, on our health outcomes, and our community sports. Nicola.
Yeah, I'd like to pick up on another point, which is I don't think that sport for development is just a sport problem. So you've talked about ministers within a sporting environment making those decisions. Actually, I think the biggest benefit for community groups would be the involvement of the Department of Education. Making school sports facilities available would be public health, understanding the physical and mental health issues concerning grassroots sports. So I'm sorry to deflect your question again, but for me, I think it's less about pitching ourselves against major championships, which I do think have some element of halo effect, and actually understanding that the sorts of social outcomes that are being tackled by community groups have a much broader remit than a DCMS remit, in that they really are about physical and mental health. And at the moment, it feels like it's a sort of one directorate approach to community sport, where I think that should be much broader.
Yeah, thank you. Heather Wheeler.
Thank you, Chairman. Having had this excellent foray into high-level stuff, can I bring you back down to some literally grassroots? So, Mark, if I may, StreetGames does support groups to apply for government funding. From the information that we've seen, that you've sent us, 67% of organisations that you're involved with applied for support through the pandemic. Why wasn't it 100%? And how did the 67% get on in receiving that money, please?
So, as I said before, between April and December last year, we brought in around £4 million directly to locally trusted organisations, and a mix of that came from things like the Sport England Emergency Fund that was around in the first instance, then the Tackling Inequalities Fund, which Nicola's already mentioned. There is still an issue, I think, with funders understanding the types of organisations we support. So I had a conversation in the West Midlands, just as a single example, with a youth organisation that was really a mental health organisation, but offered sport. And they'd made an application through to a sports fund and not been successful. And I think part of this journey that we need to go on, I think, is about understanding that the voluntary and community sector, the locally trusted organisations that we support, will present slightly differently to your traditional hockey club or your traditional rugby club in the way that they describe what they're trying to do. And I think that's challenging. I think we did a lot of work, in fact, Sported and ourselves did a lot of work on the Tackling Inequality and Economic Disadvantage Fund a few years ago with Sport England. And a lot of that was about talking to the grant assessors about how is this going to come through? When a group that isn't a sports club writes an application for sports money, what kind of language are they going to use? How are they going to describe what they do? They're not going to talk about coaches, clubs, volunteers, level 2, level 3 qualifications. They are going to talk about fun, informal activity, multi-sport on a Friday night that keeps young people diverted away from other activities and has a positive impact on their mental well-being. So I think I haven't got the figure in front of me, I think our success rate is probably around 80% for what we did with organisations last year, because it was just so focused. I mean, as an organisation during the pandemic, we've narrowed ourselves down to doing 5 things, basically. Listening to our network and really understanding their support needs, helping them with funding and fundraising. So where we raise funds nationally, we passport it onto them as much as we can, helping them with training for their workforce. So again, around fundraising, some of it, but also what we touched on before around mental health, and then advocating for them. So a lot of the funding may not have been applications necessarily. It may have been partnership introductions. So we do a lot of work with police and crime commissioners and supporting local organisations to connect with their local PCC, because PCCs want to use sport as a means to divert young people away from other behaviours. So it's not always about an application process. It can sometimes be about a partnership connection for funding.
Very interesting, Mark. Thank you very much. Nicola, do you have a similar story to tell us?
I don't have quite such a specific stat as Mark does. We do fundraising bulletins once or twice a month, where we try and signpost groups to any regional or national funds that would be relevant for them. So there isn't always that carry through in terms of us understanding whether they were successful or not, but we try and do the legwork in terms of the analysis for them. What I think has been really nice during COVID is organisations like Sported and StreetGames being given grants that we can then issue out to our members, knowing where those needs are. And some of that has been government, but actually really encouragingly, quite a lot of that has been from corporations who want to give back, but don't necessarily have the reach into the types of groups. And the other thing that they would like is, rather than just giving money and leaving a group to spend it, even given a sensible application form, it's some kind of professional support alongside that money. And I think that both StreetGames and Sported are doing that, which is that we provide business mentors to groups to make sure that they can spend the money in a sustainable way. And that's tended to give the confidence then to the funders to use us as a distribution channel.
So in effect, that's spreading the sport funding in a different way. That's really interesting. Thank you both very much indeed. Chair, back to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Heather. Just following on from our exchange before in terms of elite sport, if you like, traditional sports clubs and grassroots. Mark, in your written evidence, you say, to quote, recognise and value locally trusted community organisations in the same way as more traditional sports clubs. What would that actually mean in practice if the government was to do that?
I think this is about, if you ask people who don't know very much about sport for their mental picture of what sport looks like, it's probably a hockey club, a football club, a netball club, an after-school type provision. And for me and for us, it's about establishing that these voluntary and community sector organisations that might look a bit like youth groups, that might look a bit like tenants groups, that might look a bit like other types of voluntary organisation, absolutely have a role to play in increasing the levels of activity in the country, because we know that 65% of the young people who come along to our locally trusted organisations do no other sport outside school. So it's the only place they go to play, and in large part because of the areas we work in, that's because there aren't clubs. There aren't netball clubs, there aren't hockey clubs, there aren't other clubs in the areas that StreetGames focuses in that young people could join. I don't think there's a lack of appetite. We know that a lot of young people would like to play mainstream sport, but colleagues who were talking in the previous session, when I heard the amount that it costs to join a netball club for a month, we've done a piece of work with Sheffield Hallam that shows that low-income families have around £3.21 a week to spend on sport. Families. That's less than the cost of a single swim. So in terms of actually connecting into mainstream sport, these local organisations that can provide a sporting offer for free on the doorstep of young people in a way that they want it and still keep them active are just fundamental. And also from a cross-government point of view, they deliver across so many outcomes. They deliver community safety outcomes, they deliver public health outcomes, they deliver education outcomes. We've been involved in the, Nicola was talking about it, running a Fit and Fed programme for the last 5 years, which is around addressing holiday hunger and also getting children active and keeping them engaged in positive activity throughout the holidays. So recognising, I think, that sport clubs are really important. 20% of people who play go to NGB clubs, but there's a huge proportion of young people for whom clubs are not the answer, and these voluntary organisations need to be recognised as a core part of what sport does.
Does DCMS get that, Mark?
I think we're getting there, Chair. We had a really positive conversation with the Sports Minister a few weeks ago, where again, I mean, I was talking to the House of Lords Select Committee last week, and they asked me for a single recommendation, and it was that. It was actually let's get locally trusted organisations from the voluntary sector right at the heart of how we take forward sport, and not prioritise them completely over NGB sport. We need to keep the core market running, but we really do need to invest in these groups that make such a difference locally.
Is there any way in which the traditional clubs are not focusing enough on the people you're talking about? I mean, obviously, you use the example of our witness in the first panel, who I think was paying £25 a month in order to play netball. Now, having played cricket and having been a member of cricket clubs in the past, generally what happens is that people my age, the useless stiffs in the second 11, pay quite a bit of, pay decent, quite high subs. Whereas what then happens is that the kids effectively get it for free or as close to free as possible. Is that pattern repeated elsewhere in other sports? Is this something that you've seen? And and do you think there needs to be much more of it?
I do think that, funnily enough, my local cricket club does exactly that as well, and they do work with young people who don't have much money on the back of it. So I do think there are clubs that are prepared to heavily subsidise membership. I think there's a broader issue about, are those clubs the right location? Because it's not just about whether you can afford the membership fees. If you turn up at a cricket club as a good example, and you're a young person on a very low income, or your family's on a very low income, you won't have the bat, you won't have the pads, you won't have the bag, you won't be able to afford to go to away games. There's a whole raft of issues that aren't just purely about the cost of membership fees, but are about the way that young people fit in. And then there are some absolutely brilliant clubs that do both. So the one that gets oft quoted at the moment is Brighton Table Tennis Club. So they actually have elite performers and really great table tennis players, but they also provide free sessions for refugees, for people with learning disabilities. And it's very much for me about the culture of the club. And actually, is the club somewhere where young people feel welcomed, where young people feel comfortable? The money bit is important, because if they've only got 321 a week, that's an issue. But it's more about the environment. And I think an honest choice is important. I took my daughter to a netball club recently. They said they were a community club. My daughter's about as sporty as I am. I was never a first level player in anything. And they weren't a community club. They were a high performance club. And that was brilliant. They had a great team, but you can't then bring in young people who can barely throw a ball into that environment, because you get exactly the same response that we were talking about earlier as people who fail at school. You get that horrible sense that you're not good enough. So it's multi-dimensional, this, but certainly clubs that are prepared to make themselves really welcoming environments to a range of different participants go a long way.
And also using, I presume, any facilities they have for many different disciplines, many different types of activities. I mean, Leicestershire County Cricket Club, for instance, has quite a strong emphasis on dance, for instance, community dance, which I think feeds in very well considering the demographics of the local community and the reach that they have within that expanding reach. Is that something also that needs to be thought of? Would you both welcome the idea of more traditional clubs effectively being encouraged as much as possible in order to open up their facilities for other means of activity, but also other less formal types of sporting activity? You're nodding away, Mark.
Yeah,
sorry, Nicola.
Sorry, Nicola, go on.
Well, I think it depends whether or not you have your own facility or not. Certainly, there has been a lot of work recently, I think, where people have built large facilities, even when they are in areas of deprivation. So they've been specifically targeted at inactive audiences. And this is very much true of football. Sometimes if the pricing's wrong or the timing's wrong, actually the very people that the facility was built for don't use it. More wealthy participants will drive in and go and use these swanky new facilities. So there is a bit to do with the welcome and making the space and the time for the individuals that the facilities were targeted for. And then I wholly agree with Mark in terms of the welcome. We've done quite a lot of work around gender inclusion and getting women and girls into sport. And actually that first experience of walking in and the group and the club having set up the right infrastructure for those girls. I think Louise was talking about kit. Well, for girls, kit can be an enormous issue. Letting the girls choose the kit that they want to wear is just one of the barriers that you can remove.
Yes, just don't get John Nicholson to pick any sports kits, I have to say. Mark?
I was just reflecting that I saw walking football for over 65s happening on the cricket side of the cricket pitch at a local cricket club recently. So I think absolutely where you've got clubs that are prepared to have that community ethos, there's so much you can potentially do at that point. But it is all about people recognising. I mean, a lot of traditional sports clubs actually play their fixtures in deprived areas because land is cheaper and things like artificial pitches get built there. But as Nicola says, a lot of their members drive in from 10 miles away, play their match, drive away again. They're not the local users and the local community. And the national benchmarking survey data around leisure centres shows that problem is getting worse. Those leisure facilities in the most deprived areas are being less used by the local population than they were 5 years ago. So if we've got great facilities, which we're lucky to have in this country, I know we'll never have enough, how are we planning to create community sport hubs where young people, adults, families who live in those areas can come and use the things that are on their doorstep and feel like they are theirs, not just being used by the local club that can afford to pay?
And the role of schools, I just don't think we've covered it enough. Nearly 40% of all sports facilities are behind closed doors in schools. So something like 77% of sports halls are in school campuses. So, and those aren't available to young people in the evenings or the weekends unless they're from a progressive school who make the facilities available. I think creating a connection between community groups and the school is fundamental, not only to a variety of delivery while children are of school age, but we've talked before about that horrendous drop-off that happens, particularly with girls, when children leave school and then don't return into sport, and trying to pick up activity after that is so much more difficult. Whereas I think if they could have much more of a fluid interaction of community groups benefiting from schools' facilities, of schools' facilities benefiting from all the different sports that community groups can create, and of the young people benefiting from a pathway through from being a young person to leaving school and still having an infrastructure of sport in their lives.
Thank you. Thank you. And thank you for your evidence today, Nicola Walker and Mark Lawrie. It's been most interesting. That concludes our session. Order.